Section 38 of Mark Twain's Autobiography, Volume 2. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. Friday, March 30th, 1906. Mr. Clemens's interview with Tchaikovsky presides at a meeting of the association formed in interest of the adult blind. His first meeting with Helen Keller. Helen Keller's letter, which Mr. Clemens read at this meeting. I will drop Orion for the present and return and pick him up by and by. For the moment I am more interested in the matters of to-day than I am in Orion's adventures and mine of 45 years ago. 3 days ago a neighbor brought the celebrated Russian revolutionist Tchaikovsky to call upon me. He is grizzled and shows age as to exteriors, but he has a Vesuvius inside, which is a strong and active volcano yet. He is so full of belief in the ultimate and almost immediate triumph of the revolution and the destruction of the fiendish autocracy that he almost made me believe and hope with him. He has come over here expecting to arouse a conflagration of noble sympathy in our vast nation of 80 millions of happy and enthusiastic free men, but honesty obliged me to pour some cold water down his crater. I told him what I believed to be true, that our Christianity, which we have always been so proud of, not to say so vain of, is now nothing but a shell, a sham, a hypocrisy; that we have lost our ancient sympathy with oppressed peoples struggling for life and liberty; that when we are not coldly indifferent to such things we sneer at them, and that the sneer is about the only expression the newspapers and the nation deal in with regard to such things; that his mass meetings would not be attended by people entitled to call themselves representative Americans, even if they may call themselves Americans at all; that his audiences will be composed of foreigners who have suffered so recently that they have not yet had time to become Americanized, and their hearts turned to stone in their breasts; that these audiences will be drawn from the ranks of the poor, not those of the rich; that they will give, and give freely, but they will give from their poverty, and the money result will not be large. I said that when our windy and flamboyant President conceived the idea, a year ago, of advertising himself to the world as the new angel of peace, and set himself the task of bringing about the peace between Russia and Japan, and had the misfortune to accomplish his misbegotten purpose, no one in all this nation except Dr. Seaman and myself uttered a public protest against this folly of follies; that at that time I believed that that fatal peace had postponed the Russian nation's imminent liberation from its age-long chains indefinitely, probably for centuries; that I believed at that time that Roosevelt had given the Russian Revolution its death blow, and that I am of that opinion yet. I will mention here, in parenthesis, that I came across Dr. Seaman last night for the first time in my life, and found that his opinion also remains today as he expressed it at the time that that infamous peace was consummated. Tchaikovsky said that my talk depressed him profoundly, and that he hoped I was wrong. I said I hoped the same. He said, "Why, from this very nation of yours came a mighty contribution only 2 or 3 months ago, and it made us all glad in Russia. You raised $2 millions in a breath, in a moment, as it were, and sent that contribution, that most noble and generous contribution, to suffering Russia. Does not that modify your opinion?" "No," I said, "it doesn't. That money came not from Americans. It came from Jews, much of it from rich Jews, but the most of it from Russian and Polish Jews on the East Side. That is to say, it came from the very poor. The Jew has always been benevolent. Suffering can always move a Jew's heart and tax his pocket to the limit. He will be at your mass meetings. But if you find any Americans there, put them in a glass case and exhibit them. It will be worthy 50 cents a head to go and look at that show and try to believe in it." He asked me to come to last night's meeting and speak, but I had another engagement and could not do it. Then he asked me to write a line or two, which could be read at the meeting, and I did that cheerfully. From the New York Times: "Arms to free Russia. Tchaikovsky's appeal. Revolutionist speaks to cheering audience of 3,000. Says the battle is near. Mark Twain writes that he hopes czars and grand dukes will soon become scarce." "Tovarischi," when Nicholas Tchaikovsky, hailed by his countrymen here as the father of the revolutionary movement in Russia, spoke this word last night in Grand Central Palace, 3,000 men and women rose to their feet, waved their hats, and cheered madly for 3 minutes. The word means comrades. It is the watchword of the revolutionists. The spirit of revolution possessed the mass meeting called to greet the Russian patriot now visiting New York. Fight is what he wants, and arms to fight with. He told the audience so last night, and by their cheers they promised to do their part in supplying the sinews of war. Mark Twain could not attend because he had already accepted an invitation to another meeting, but he sent this letter: "Dear Mr. Tchaikovsky, I thank you for the honor of the invitation, but I am not able to accept it because Thursday evening I shall be presiding at a meeting whose object is to find remunerative work for certain classes of our blind who would gladly support themselves if they had the opportunity. My sympathies are with the Russian Revolution, of course. It goes without saying. I hope it will succeed, and now that I have talked with you I take heart to believe it will. Government by falsified promises, by lies, by treachery, and by the butcher knife for the aggrandizement of a single family of drones and its idle and vicious kin has been borne quite long enough in Russia, I should think, and it is to be hoped that the roused nation, now rising in its strength, will presently put an end to it and set up the republic in its place. Some of us, even the white-headed, may live to see the blessed day when czars and grand dukes will be as scarce there as I trust they are in heaven. Most sincerely yours, Mark Twain. Mr. Tchaikovsky made an impassioned appeal for help to inaugurate a real revolution and overturn the Czar and all his allies. The engagement which I spoke of to Tchaikovsky was to act as chairman at the first meeting of the association, which was formed 5 months ago in the interest of the adult blind. Joseph H. Choate and I had a very good time there, and I came away with the conviction that that excellent enterprise is going to flourish, and will bear abundant fruit. The State of New York contains 6,000 listed blind persons, and also 1,000 or so who have not been searched out and listed. There are between 300 and 400 blind children. The State confines its benevolence to these. It confers upon them a book education. It teaches them to read and write. It feeds them and shelters them, and of course it pauperizes them, because it furnishes them no way of earning a living for themselves. The State's conduct toward the adult blind, and this conduct is imitated by the legislatures of most of the other States, is purely infamous. Outside of the blind asylums the adult blind person has a hard time. He lives merely by the charity of the compassionate, when he has no relatives able to support him, and now and then, as a benevolence, the State stretches out its charitable hand and lifts him over to Blackwell's Island, and submerges him among that multitudinous population of thieves and prostitutes. But in Massachusetts, in Pennsylvania, and in 2 or 3 other States, associations like this new one we have formed have been at work for some years, supported entirely by private subscriptions, and the benefits conferred and the work accomplished are so fine and great that their official reports read like a fairy tale. It seems almost proven that there are not so very many things accomplishable by persons gifted with sight which a blind person cannot learn to do, and do as well as that other person. Helen Keller was to have been present last night, but she is ill in bed, and has been ill in bed during several weeks, through overwork, in the interest of the blind, the deaf, and the dumb. I need not go into any particulars about Helen Keller. She is fellow to Caesar, Alexander, Napoleon, Homer, Shakespeare, and the rest of the immortals. She will be as famous 1,000 years from now as she is today. I remember the first time I ever had the privilege of seeing her. She was 14 years old then. She was to be at Lawrence Hutton's house on a Sunday afternoon, and 12 or 15 men and women had been invited to come and see her. Henry Rogers and I went together. The company had all assembled and had been waiting a while. The wonderful child arrived now, with her about equally wonderful teacher, Miss Sullivan. The girl began to deliver happy ejaculations in her broken speech, without touching anything, and without seeing anything, of course, and without hearing anything. She seemed to quite well recognize the character of her surroundings. She said, "Oh, the books, the books! So many, many books! How lovely!" The guests were brought one after another and introduced to her. As she shook hands with each she took her hand away and laid her fingers lightly against Miss Sullivan's lips, who spoke against them the person's name. When a name was difficult Miss Sullivan not only spoke it against Miss Helen's fingers, but spelled it upon Helen's hand with her own fingers. stenographically apparently, for the swiftness of the operation was suggestive of that. Mr. Howells seated himself by Helen on the sofa, and she put her fingers against his lips, and he told her a story of considerable length, and you could see each detail of it pass into her mind and strike fire there and throw the flash of it into her face. Then I told her a long story, which she interrupted all along, and in the right places, with cackles, chuckles, and care-free bursts of laughter. Then Miss Sullivan put one of Helen's hands against her lips and spoke against it the question, "What is Mr. Clemens distinguished for?" Helen answered in her crippled speech, "For his humor." I spoke up modestly and said, "And for his wisdom." Helen said the same words instantly, "And for his wisdom." I suppose it was a case of mental telegraphy, since there was no way for her to know what it was I had said. After a couple of hours spent very pleasantly, some one asked if Helen would remember the feel of the hands of the company after this considerable interval of time, and be able to discriminate the hands and name the possessors of them. Miss Sullivan said, "Oh, she will have no difficulty about that." So the company filed past, shook hands in turn, and with each handshake Helen greeted the owner of the hand pleasantly, and spoke the name that belonged to it without hesitation until she encountered Mr. Rogers toward the end of the procession. She shook hands with him, then paused, and a reflecting expression came into her face. Then she said, "I am glad to meet you now. I have not met you before." Miss Sullivan told her she was mistaken. This gentleman was introduced to her when she first arrived in the room. But Helen was not affected by that. She said no, she never had met this gentleman before. Then Mr. Rogers said that perhaps the confusion might be explained by the fact that he had his glove on when he was introduced to Helen. Of course that explained the matter. This was not in the afternoon, as I have misstated. It was in the forenoon, and by the assemblage proceeded to the dining room and sat down to luncheon. I had to go away before it was over, and as I passed by Helen I patted her lightly on the head and passed on. Miss Sullivan called to me and said, "Stop, Mr. Clemens. Helen is distressed because she did not recognize your hand. Won't you come back and do that again?" I went back and patted her lightly on the head, and she said at once, "Oh, it's Mr. Clemens." Perhaps some one can explain this miracle, but I have never been able to do it. Could she feel the wrinkles in my hand through her hair? Some one else must answer this. I am not competent. As I have said, Helen was not able to leave her sick bed, but she wrote a letter 2 or 3 days ago to be read at the meeting, and Miss Holt, the secretary, sent it to me by a messenger at mid-afternoon yesterday. It was lucky for me that she didn't reserve it and send it to me on the platform last night, for in that case I could not have gotten through with it. I read it to the house without a break in my voice, and also without even a tremor in it that could be noticed, I think. But it was because I had read it aloud to Miss Lyon at mid-afternoon, and I knew the dangerous places and how to be prepared for them. I told the house in the beginning that I had this letter, and that I would read it at the end of the evening's activities. By and by, when the end had arrived and Mr. Choate had spoken, I introduced the letter with a few words. I said that if I knew anything about literature, here was a fine and great and noble sample of it; that this letter was simple, direct, unadorned, unaffected, unpretentious, and was moving and beautiful and eloquent; that no fellow to it had ever issued from any girl's lips since Joan of Arc, that immortal child of 17, stood alone and friendless in her chains 5 centuries ago, and confronted her judges, the concentrated learning and intellect of France, and fenced with them week by week and day by day, answering them out of her great heart and her untaught but marvelous mind, and always defeated them, always camping on the field and master of it as each day's sun went down. I said I believed that this letter, written by a young woman who has been stone deaf, dumb, and blind ever since she was 18 months old, and who is one of the most widely and thoroughly educated women in the world, would pass into our literature as a classic, and remain so. I will insert the letter here. Wrentham, Massachusetts, March 27, 1906. My dear Mr. Clemens, it is a great disappointment to me not to be with you and the other friends who have joined their strength to uplift the blind. The meeting in New York will be the greatest occasion in the movement which has so long engaged my heart, and I regret keenly not to be present and feel the inspiration of living contact with such an assembly of wit, wisdom, and philanthropy. I should be happy if I could have spelled into my hand the words as they fall from your lips, and receive, even as it is uttered, the eloquence of our newest ambassador to the blind. We have not had such advocates before. My disappointment is softened by the thought that never at any meeting was the right word so sure to be spoken. But, superfluous as all other appeal must seem after you and Mr. Choate have spoken, nevertheless, as I am a woman, I cannot be silent, and I ask you to read this letter, knowing that it will be lifted to eloquence by your kindly voice. To know what the blind man needs, you who can see must imagine what it would be not to see, and you can imagine it more vividly if you remember that before your journey's end you may have to go the dark way yourself. Try to realize what blindness means to those whose joyous activity is stricken to inaction. It is to live long, long days, and life is made up of days. It is to live immured, baffled, impotent, all God's world shut out. It is to sit helpless, defrauded, while your spirit strains and tugs at its fetters, and your shoulders ache for the burden they are denied, the rightful burden of labor. The seeing man goes about his business confident and self-dependent. He does his share of the work of the world in mine, in quarry, in factory, in counting room, asking of others no boon save the opportunity to do a man's part and to receive the laborer's guerdon. In an instant accident blinds him, the day is blotted out, night envelops all the visible world. The feet which once bore him to the task with firm and confident stride stumble and halt and fear the forward step. He is forced to a new habit of idleness, which like a canker consumes the mind and destroys its beautiful faculties. Memory confronts him with his lighted past. Amid the tangled ruins of his life as it promised to be, he gropes his pitiful way. You have met him on your busy thoroughfares with faltering feet and outstretched hands, patiently dredging the universal dark, holding out for sale his petty wares, or his cap for your pennies. And this was a man with ambitions and capabilities. It is because we know that these ambitions and capabilities can be fulfilled that we are working to improve the condition of the adult blind. You cannot bring back the light to the vacant eyes, but you can give a helping hand to the sightless along their dark pilgrimage. You can teach them new skill. For work they once did with the aid of their eyes, you can substitute work that they can do with their hands. They ask only opportunity, and opportunity is a torch in darkness. They crave no charity, no pension, but the satisfaction that comes from lucrative toil, and this satisfaction is the right of every human being. At your meeting, New York will speak its word for the blind, and when New York speaks, the world listens. The true message of New York is not the commercial ticking of busy telegraphs, but the mightier utterances of such gatherings as yours. Of late our periodicals have been filled with depressing revelations of great social evils. Garrulous critics have pointed to every flaw in our civic structure. We have listened long enough to the pessimists. You once told me you were a pessimist, Mr. Clemens, but great men are usually mistaken about themselves. You are an optimist. If you were not, you would not preside at the meeting, for it is an answer to pessimism. It proclaims that the heart and the wisdom of a great city are devoted to the good of mankind, that in this busiest city in the world no cry of distress goes up but receives a compassionate and generous answer. Rejoice that the cause of the blind has been heard in New York, for the day after it shall be heard round the world. Yours sincerely, Helen Keller. End of Section 38, Friday, March 30th, 1906. Section 39 of Mark Twain's Autobiography, Volume 2. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. Monday, April 2, 1906. Government of New Territory of Nevada, Governor Nye and the Practical Jokers. Mr. Clemens begins journalistic life on Virginia City Enterprise, reports legislative sessions. He and Orion prosper. Orion builds $12,000 house. Governor Nye turns Territory of Nevada into a state. Promotion for Barnes, whom Tillman berated. Had woman ejected from White House to be postmaster. Merritt gets new place. Present postmaster at Washington to be made collector at Niagara. Platt not consulted. Special to the New York Times. Washington, March 31st. President Roosevelt surprised the Capitol this afternoon by announcing that he would appoint Benjamin F. Barnes as postmaster of Washington to succeed John A. Merritt of New York. Mr. Merritt, who for several years has been postmaster here, has been chosen for collector of the port of Niagara, succeeding the late Major James Low. Mr. Barnes is at present Assistant Secretary to the President. Only a short time ago he figured extensively in the newspapers for having ordered the forcible ejection from the White House of Mrs. Minor Morris, a Washington woman who had called to see the President. What attracted attention to the case was not the ejection itself, but the violence with which it was performed. Mrs. Morris, who had been talking to Barnes in an ordinary conversational tone, and with no indications of excitement, so far as the spectators observed, was seized by two policemen and dragged by the arms out of the building and across the asphalt walk in front of the White House, a distance corresponding to that of 2 ordinary city blocks. During a part of the journey a negro carried her by the feet. Her dress was torn and trampled. She was locked up on a charge of disorderly conduct, and when it was learned that she would be released on that charge a policeman, a relative of Barnes's, was sent to the house of detention to prefer a charge of insanity against her, so that she would have to be held. She was held accordingly until 2 physicians had examined her and pronounced her sane. He was denounced by Mrs. Morris, by various newspapers, and by Mr. Tillman in the Senate. The appointment of Barnes to be the postmaster so soon after this incident has created endless talk here. It is taken to be the President's way of expressing confidence in Barnes, and repaying him for the pain he suffered as a result of the newspaper criticisms of his course. Orion Clemens again. To continue. The government of the new territory of Nevada was an interesting menagerie. Governor Nye was an old and seasoned politician from New York. Politician, not statesman. He had white hair. He was in fine physical condition. He had a winningly friendly face and deep, lustrous brown eyes that could talk as a native language the tongue of every feeling, every passion, every emotion. His eyes could outtalk his tongue, and this is saying a good deal, for he was a very remarkable talker, both in private and on the stump. He was a shrewd man. He generally saw through surfaces, and perceived what might be going on inside without being suspected of having an eye on the matter. When grown-up persons indulge in practical jokes, the fact gauges them. They have lived narrow, obscure, and ignorant lives, and at full manhood they still retain and cherish a job lot of left-over standards and ideals that would have been discarded with their boyhood if they had then moved out into the world and a broader life. There were many practical jokers in the new territory. I do not take pleasure in exposing this fact, for I liked those people, but what I am to say is true. I wish I could say a kindlier thing about them instead. If I could say they were burglars or hat-rack thieves, or something like that, that wouldn't be utterly uncomplimentary. I would prefer it, but I can't say those things. They would not be true. These people were practical jokers, and I will not try to disguise it. In other respects they were plenty good enough people, honest people, reputable and likable. They played practical jokes upon each other with success, and got the admiration and applause, and also the envy of the rest of the community. Naturally they were eager to try their arts on big game, and that was what the governor was. But they were not able to score. They made several efforts, but the governor defeated these efforts without any trouble, and went on smiling his pleasant smile as if nothing had happened. Finally the joker chiefs of Carson City and Virginia City conspired together to see if their combined talent couldn't win a victory, for the jokers were getting into a very uncomfortable place. The people were laughing at them instead of at their proposed victim. They banded themselves together to the number of 10 and invited the governor to what was a most extraordinary attention in those days, a pickled oyster stew and champagne, luxuries very seldom seen in that region, and existing rather as fabrics of the imagination than as facts. The Governor took me with him. He said, disparagingly, "It's a poor invention. It doesn't deceive. Their idea is to get me drunk and leave me under the table, and from their standpoint this will be very funny. But they don't know me. I am familiar with champagne, and have no prejudices against it." The fate of the joke was not decided until 2 o'clock in the morning. At that hour the Governor was serene, genial, comfortable, contented, happy, and sober, although he was so full that he couldn't laugh without shedding champagne tears. Also, at that hour, the last joker joined his comrades under the table, drunk to the last perfection. The Governor remarked, "This is a dry place, Sam. Let's go and get something to drink and go to bed." The Governor's official menagerie had been drawn from the humblest ranks of his constituents at home, harmless good fellows who had helped in his campaigns, and now they had their reward in petty salaries payable in greenbacks that were worth next to nothing. Those boys had a hard time to make both ends meet. Orion's salary was $1,800 a year, and he couldn't even support his dictionary on it. But the Irishwoman who had come out on the Governor's staff charged the menagerie only $10 a week apiece for board and lodging. Orion and I were of her boarders and lodgers, and so, on these cheap terms, the silver I had brought from home held out very well. At first I roamed about the country seeking silver, but at the end of '62 or the beginning of '63, when I came up from Aurora to begin a journalistic life on the Virginia City Enterprise, I was presently sent down to Carson City to report the legislative session. Orion was soon very popular with the members of the legislature, because they found that whereas they couldn't usually trust each other, nor anybody else, they could trust him. He easily held the belt for honesty in that country, but it didn't do him any good in a pecuniary way, because he had no talent for either persuading or scaring legislators. But I was differently situated. I was there every day in the legislature to distribute compliment and censure with evenly balanced justice, and spread the same over half a page of the Enterprise every morning. Consequently, I was an influence. I got the legislature to pass a law requiring every corporation doing business in the Territory to record its charter in full, without skipping a word, in a record to be kept by the Secretary of the Territory, my brother. All the charters were framed in exactly the same words. For this record service he was authorized to charge 40 cents a folio of 100 words for making the record, $5 for furnishing a certificate of each record, and so on. Everybody had a toll road franchise, but no toll road. But the franchise had to be recorded and paid for. Everybody was a mining corporation, and had to have himself recorded and pay for it. Very well, we prospered. The record service paid an average of $1,000 a month, in gold. Governor Nye was often absent from the Territory. He liked to run down to San Francisco every little while and enjoy a rest from territorial civilization. Nobody complained, for he was prodigiously popular. He had been a stage driver in his early days in New York or New England, and had acquired the habit of remembering names and faces, and of making himself agreeable to his passengers. As a politician this had been valuable to him, and he kept his arts in good condition by practice. By the time he had been Governor a year he had shaken hands with every human being in the Territory of Nevada, and after that he always knew these people instantly at sight and could call them by name. The whole population of 20,000 persons were his personal friends, and he could do anything he chose to do and count upon their being contented with it. Whenever he was absent from the Territory, which was generally, Orion served his office in his place, as acting Governor, a title which was soon and easily shortened to Governor. Mrs. Governor, or Clemens, enjoyed being a governor's wife. No one on this planet ever enjoyed a distinction more than she enjoyed that one. Her delight in being the head of society was so frank that it disarmed criticism and even envy. Being the governor's wife and head of society, she looked for a proper kind of house to live in, a house commensurate with these dignities, and she easily persuaded Orion to build that house. Orion could be persuaded to do anything. He built and furnished the house at a cost of $12,000, and there was no other house in that capital that could approach this property for style and cost. When Governor Nye's 4-year term was drawing to a close, the mystery of why he had ever consented to leave the great State of New York and help inhabit that sagebrush desert was solved. He had gone out there in order to become a United States Senator. All that was now necessary was to turn the Territory into a State. He did it without any difficulty. That patch of sand and that sparse population were not well fitted for the heavy burden of a State government, but no matter, the people were willing to have the change, and so the governor's game was made. Orion's game was made, too, apparently, for he was as popular because of his honesty as the governor was for more substantial reasons. But at the critical moment the inborn capriciousness of his character rose up without warning, and disaster followed. End of Section 39, Monday, April 2, 1906. Section 40 of Mark Twain's Autobiography, Volume 2. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. Wednesday, April 4, 1906. The Morris case again. Scope of this autobiography, a mirror. More about Nast sale, laurels for Mr. Clemens. Clippings in regard to Woman's University Club reception. Mr. Clemens comments on them. Vassar benefit at Hudson Theater. Mr. Clemens meets many old friends. Mrs. Morris case in Senate. Nomination of Barnes opens way for an inquiry. Special to the New York Times. Washington, April 3. Criticism of the appointment of Mr. Roosevelt's Assistant Secretary B. F. Barnes to be Postmaster of Washington continues. It now seems likely that the appointment may have a hard time in passing the Senate. Barnes' action in having Mrs. Minor Morris put out of the White House is the chief ground of opposition. The Senate Committee on the Post Offices and Post Roads has determined to investigate Barnes' action in the Morris case, and eyewitnesses of the affair have been summoned to appear before the committee to morrow and tell what they saw. This is the same investigation which Mr. Tillman requested and which the Senate refused to grant. It now comes as the result of the President's action in appointing Barnes postmaster. The witnesses who are to appear before the committee were not asked to testify in the investigation which the President made when he decided that Barnes' course was justified. There was much speculation today as to who Mr. Barnes' successor as Assistant Secretary would be. The Evening Star tonight devotes a column and a half to suggestions on the subject, saying that the leading candidates are John L. McGrew, a clerk in the White House offices, Warren Young, Chief Executive Clerk, M.C. Latta, the President's personal stenographer, James J. Corbett of New York, Robert Fitzsimmons, Augustus Rulin, and James J. Jeffries. The article is illustrated with two pictures of Corbett and Fitzsimmons. That is neat, and causes me much gentle delight. The point of that whole matter lies in the last four names that are mentioned in it. These four men are prize fighters, the most celebrated ones now living. Is the incident now closed? Again, we cannot tell. The smell of it may linger in American history 1,000 years yet. This autobiography of mine differs from other autobiographies, differs from all other autobiographies, except Benvenuto's, perhaps. The conventional biography of all the ages is an open window. The autobiographer sits there and examines and discusses the people that go by, not all of them, but the notorious ones, the famous ones, those that wear fine uniforms and crowns when it is not raining, and very great poets and great statesmen, illustrious people with whom he has had the high privilege of coming in contact. He likes to toss a wave of recognition to these with his hand as they go by, and he likes to notice that the others are seeing him do this and admiring. He likes to let on that in discussing these occasional people that wear the good clothes he is only interested in interesting his reader, and is in a measure unconscious of himself. But this autobiography of mine is not that kind of an autobiography. This autobiography of mine is a mirror, and I am looking at myself in it all the time. Incidentally, I notice the people that pass along at my back. I get glimpses of them in the mirror, and whenever they say or do anything that can help advertise me and flatter me and raise me in my own estimation, I set these things down in my autobiography. I rejoice when a king or a duke comes my way and makes himself useful to this autobiography. But they are rare customers, with wide intervals between. I can use them with good effect as lighthouses and monuments along my way, but for real business I depend upon the common herd. Here is some more about the Nast sale. 30 cents for McCurdy poem. Other literary curiosities from the Nast collection at auction. The sale of autograph letters, wash drawings, and pencil and pen ink sketches, the property of the late Thomas Nast, the cartoonist, was continued yesterday by the Merwin Clayton Company. 5 letters from Theodore Roosevelt as police commissioner, colonel of the Rough Riders, governor, and president, to Mr. Nast, thanking him for sketches and expressing warm friendship for the cartoonist, brought prices ranging from $1.50 to $2.25. Richard A. McCurdy's autograph letter and original autograph poem addressed to Nast, with a typewritten copy of the poem, brought 30 cents the lot. The following letter, written by General Philip H. Sheridan to Nast, was bid in at $12.25 by J. H. Manning, a son of the late Daniel Manning. May 12, 1875. Dear Nast, it is true. I will be married on the 30th of June coming, unless there is a slip between the cup and the lip, which is scarcely possible. I will not have any wedding for many reasons, among them the recent death of my father. I am very happy, but wish the damn thing was over. Yours truly, Sheridan. P.S. and M.I. I send the enclosed for your oldest. Please send me yours to be kept for mine. P.H.S. A letter written by Lincoln, and which was laid over a piece of white silk bearing a faded red stain, sold for $38. The attached certificate stated that the silk was from the dress of Laura Keene, worn on the night of Lincoln's assassination, and that the stain was made by his blood. General W. T. Sherman's letter to Nast, dated March 9, 1879, endorsing a testimonial of the cartoonist's services to the Army and Navy, sold for $6. A scrapbook containing sketches of Lincoln, Sumner, Greeley, Walt Whitman, and many watercolor sketches, brought $75. A sketch of William M. Tweed and his companion Hunt under arrest brought $21. Two companion Christmas sketches by Nast, representing a child telephoning to Santa Claus, brought $43 each. A sketch of General Grant was bid in for $36. A sketch of the G.O.P. elephant brought $28. A sketch representing the Savior, full face, with nimbus, brought $65. An autograph photograph of Theodore Roosevelt, dated 1884, was bid in at $5. It is a great satisfaction to me to notice that I am still ahead of Roosevelt, ahead of Sherman, ahead of Sheridan, even ahead of Lincoln. These are fine laurels, but they will not last. A time is coming when some of them will wither. A day will come when a mere scratch of Mr. Lincoln's pen will outsell a whole basketful of my letters. A time will come when a scratch of the pens of those immortal soldiers, Sherman and Sheridan, will outsell 1,000 scratches of mine, and so I shall enjoy my supremacy now while I may. I shall read that clipping over 40 or 50 times now while it is new and true, and let the desolating future take care of itself. Day before yesterday all Vassar, ancient and modern, packed itself into the Hudson Theater, and I was there. The occasion was a benefit arranged by Vassar and its friends to raise money to aid poor students of that college in getting through the college course. I was not aware that I was to be a feature of the show, and was distressed and most uncomfortably inflamed with blushes when I found it out. Really, the distress and the blushes were manufactured, for at bottom I was glad. I held a reception on that stage for an hour or two, and all Vassar, ancient and modern, shook hands with me. Some of the moderns were too beautiful for words, and I was very friendly with those. I was so hoping somebody would want to kiss me for my mother, but I didn't dare to suggest it myself. Presently, however, when it happened, I did what I could to make it contagious, and succeeded. This required art, but I had it in stock. I seemed to take the old and the new as they came, without discrimination, but I averaged the percentage to my advantage, and without anybody's suspecting, I think. Among that host I met again as many as half a dozen pretty old girls whom I had met in their bloom at Vassar that time that Susy and I visited the college so long ago. Yesterday, at the University Club, almost all the 500 were of the young and lovely, untouched by care, unfaded by age. There were girls there from Smith, Wellesley, Radcliffe, Vassar, and Barnard, together with a sprinkling of college girls from the South, from the Middle West, and the Pacific Coast. I delivered a moral sermon to the Barnard girls at Columbia University a few weeks ago, and now it was like being among old friends. There were dozens of Barnard girls there, scores of them, and I had already shaken hands with them at Barnard. As I have said, the reporter heard many things there yesterday, but there were several which he didn't hear. One sweet creature wanted to whisper in my ear, and I was nothing loath. She raised her dainty form on tiptoe, lifting herself with a grip of her velvet hands on my shoulders, and put her lips to my ear and said, "How do you like being the belle of New York?" It was so true, and so gratifying that it crimsoned me with blushes, and I could make no reply. The reporter lost that. Two girls, one from Maine, the other from Ohio, were grandchildren of fellow passengers who sailed with me in the Quaker City in the Innocents Abroad excursion 39 years ago. End of Section 40, Wednesday, April 4th, 1906. Section 41 of Mark Twain's Autobiography, Volume 2. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. Thursday, April 5th, 1906. Ellen Terry's farewell banquet on 50th anniversary. Mr. Clemens's cablegram. Mr. Clemens has fine new idea for a play. Mr. Hammond Trumbull squelches it. Orion Clemens is defeated as Secretary of State. At Mr. Camp's suggestion, Mr. Clemens speculates unfortunately. Mr. Camp offers to buy Tennessee land for $200,000. Orion refuses. Mr. Clemens just discovers that he still owns 1,000 acres of the Tennessee land. Orion comes east, gets position on Hartford Evening Post. After various business ventures he returns to Keokuk and tries raising chickens. The other day I furnished a sentiment in response to a man's request, to wit, the noblest work of God, man. Who found it out? Man. I thought it was very good and smart, but the other person didn't. Ellen Terry has been a queen of the English stage for 50 years, and will retire from it on the 28th of this month, which will be the 50th anniversary. She will retire in due form at a great banquet in London, and cablegrams, meet for the occasion, will flow in upon the banqueters from old friends of hers in America and other formerly distant regions of the earth. There are no distant regions now. The American cablegrams are being collected by a committee in New York, and by request I have furnished mine. To do these things by cable at 25 cents a word is the modern way, and the only way. They could go by post at no expense, but it wouldn't be good form. Privately I will remark that they do go by mail, dated to suit the requirements. Cablegram to Ellen Terry, London. Age has not withered, nor custom staled, the admiration and affection I have felt for you so many, many years. I lay them at your honored feet, with the strength and freshness of their youth upon them undiminished. Mark Twain. She is a lovely character, as was also Sir Henry Irving, who lately departed this life. I first knew them 34 years ago in London, and thenceforth held them in high esteem and affection. Orion Clemens resumed. There were several candidates for all the offices in the gift of the new State of Nevada, save two: United States Senator Governor Nye, and Secretary of State Orion Clemens. Nye was certain to get a senatorship, and Orion was so sure to get the secretaryship that no one but him was named for that office. But he was hit with one of his spasms of virtue on the very day that the Republican party was to make its nominations in the convention. Orion refused to go near the convention. He was urged, but all persuasions failed. He said his presence there would be an unfair and improper influence, and that if he was to be nominated the compliment must come to him as a free and unspotted gift. This attitude would have settled his case for him without further effort, but he had another spasm of virtue on the same day, and that made it absolutely sure. It had been his habit for a great many years to change his religion with his shirt, and his ideas about temperance at the same time. He would be a teetotaler for a while, and the champion of the cause. Then he would change to the other side for a time. On nomination day he suddenly changed from a friendly attitude toward whiskey, which was the popular attitude, to uncompromising teetotalism, and went absolutely dry. His friends besought and implored, but all in vain. He could not be persuaded to cross the threshold of a saloon. The paper next morning contained the list of chosen nominees. His name was not in it. He had not received a vote. His rich income ceased when the State government came into power. He was without an occupation. Something had to be done. He put up his sign as attorney at law, but he got no clients. It was strange. It was difficult to account for. I cannot account for it, but if I were going to guess at a solution I should guess that by the make of him he would examine both sides of a case so diligently and so conscientiously that when he got through with his argument neither he nor a jury would know which side he was on. I think that his client would find out his make in laying his case before him, and would take warning and withdraw it in time to save himself from probable disaster. I had taken up my residence in San Francisco about a year before the time I have just been speaking of. One day I got a tip from Mr. Camp, a bold man who was always making big fortunes in ingenious speculations. and losing them again in the course of 6 months by other speculative ingenuities. Camp told me to buy some shares in the Hale and Norcross. I bought 50 shares at $300 a share. I bought on a margin and put up 20%. It exhausted my funds. I wrote Orion and offered him half, and asked him to send his share of the money. I waited and waited. He wrote and said he was going to attend to it. The stock went along up pretty briskly. It went higher and higher. It reached $1,000 a share. It climbed to 2,000, then to 3,000, then to twice that figure. The money did not come, but I was not disturbed. By and by that stock took a turn and began to gallop down. Then I wrote urgently. Orion answered that he had sent the money long ago, said he had sent it to the Occidental Hotel. I inquired for it. They said it was not there. To cut a long story short, that stock went on down until it fell below the price I had paid for it. Then it began to eat up the margin, and when at last I got out I was very badly crippled. When it was too late I found out what had become of Orion's money. Any other human being would have sent a check, but he sent gold. The hotel clerk put it in the safe and never thought of it again, and there it reposed all this time, enjoying its fatal work, no doubt. Another man might have thought to tell me that the money was not in a letter, but was in an express package, but it never occurred to Orion to do that. Later Mr. Camp gave me another chance. He agreed to buy our Tennessee land for $200,000, pay a part of the money in cash, and give long notes for the rest. His scheme was to import foreigners from grape growing and wine making districts in Europe, settle them on the land, and turn it into a wine growing country. He knew what Mr. Longworth thought of those Tennessee grapes, and was satisfied. I sent the contracts and things to Orion for his signature, he being one of the three heirs, but they arrived at a bad time, in a doubly bad time, in fact. The temperance virtue was temporarily upon him in strong force, and he wrote and said he would not be a party to debauching the country with wine. Also, he said, how could he know whether Mr. Camp was going to deal fairly and honestly with those poor people from Europe or not? And so, without waiting to find out, he quashed the whole trade, and there it fell, never to be brought to life again. The land, from being suddenly worth $200,000, became as suddenly worth what it was before, nothing, and taxes to pay. I had paid the taxes and the other expenses for some years, but I dropped the Tennessee land there, and have never taken any interest in it since, pecuniarily or otherwise, until yesterday. I had supposed, until yesterday, that Orion had frittered away the last acre, and indeed that was his impression, but a gentleman arrived yesterday from Tennessee and brought a map showing that by a correction of the ancient surveys we still own 1,000 acres in a coal district, out of the 100,000 acres which my father left us when he died in 1847. The gentleman brought a proposition. Also he brought a reputable and well-to-do citizen of New York. The proposition was that the Tennessean gentleman should sell that land, that the New York gentleman should pay all the expenses and fight all the lawsuits in case any should turn up, and that of such profit as might eventuate, the Tennessean gentleman should take a third, the New Yorker a third, and Sam Moffett and his sister, Mrs. Charles L. Webster, and I, who are the surviving heirs, the remaining third. This time I hope we shall get rid of the Tennessee land for good and all, and never hear of it again. It was created under a misapprehension. My father loaded himself up with it under a misapprehension. He unloaded it on to us under a misapprehension, and I should like to get rid of the accumulated misapprehensions and what is left of the land as soon as possible. I came East in January, 1867. Orion remained in Carson City perhaps a year longer. Then he sold his $12,000 house and its furniture for $3,500 in greenbacks at about 30% discount. He and his wife took first-class passage in the steamer for New York. In New York they stopped at an expensive hotel, explored the city in an expensive way, then fled to Keokuk, and arrived there about as nearly penniless as they were when they had migrated thence in July, '61. About 1871 or '72 they came to New York. They were obliged to go somewhere. Orion had been trying to make a living in the law ever since he had arrived from the Pacific coast, but he had secured only 2 cases. Those he was to try free of charge, but the possible result will never be known, because the parties settled the case out of court without his help. I had bought my mother a house in Keokuk. I was giving her a stated sum monthly, and Orion another stated sum. They all lived together in the house. But, as I say, they came East, and Orion got a job as proofreader on the New York Evening Post at $10 a week. They took a single small room, and in it they cooked and lived on that money. By and by Orion came to Hartford and wanted me to get him a place as reporter on a Hartford paper. Here was a chance to try my scheme again, and I did it. I made him go to the Hartford Evening Post without any letter of introduction, and propose to scrub and sweep and do all sorts of things for nothing, on the plea that he didn't need money, but only needed work, and that was what he was pining for. Within 6 weeks he was on the editorial staff of that paper at $20 a week, and he was worth the money. He was presently called for by some other paper at better wages, but I made him go to the Post people and tell them about it. They stood the raise and kept him. It was the pleasantest berth he had ever had in his life. It was an easy berth. He was in every way comfortable. But ill luck came. It was bound to come. A new Republican daily was to be started in Ratland, Vermont, by a stock company of well-to-do politicians, and they offered Orion the chief editorship at $3,000 a year. He was eager to accept. His wife was equally eager, no, twice as eager, 3 times as eager. My beseechings and reasonings went for nothing. I said, "You are as weak as water. Those people will find it out right away. They will easily see that you have no backbone, that they can deal with you as they would deal with a slave. You may last 6 months, but not longer. Then they will not dismiss you as they would dismiss a gentleman. They will fling you out as they would fling out an intruding tramp." Well, it happened just so. Then Orion and his wife migrated to that persecuted and unoffending Keokuk once more. Orion wrote from there that he was not resuming the law, that he thought that what his health needed was the open air, in some sort of outdoor occupation, that his old father in law had a strip of ground on the river border a mile above Keokuk, with some sort of a house on it, and his idea was to buy that place and start a chicken farm, and provide Keokuk with chickens and eggs, and perhaps butter, but I don't know whether you can raise butter on a chicken farm or not. He said the place could be had for $3,000 cash, and I sent the money. Orion began to raise chickens, and he made a detailed monthly report to me, whereby it appeared that he was able to work off his chickens on the Keokuk people at $1.25 a pair, but it also appeared that it cost $1.60 to raise the pair. This did not seem to discourage Orion, and so I let it go. Meantime he was borrowing $100 per month of me regularly, month by month. Now, to show Orion's stern and rigid business ways, and he really prided himself on his large business capacities, the moment he received the advance of $100 at the beginning of each month he sent me his note for the amount, and with it he sent, out of that money, 3 months' interest on the $100 at 6% per annum, these notes being always for 3 months. I did not keep them, of course. They were of no value to anybody. As I say, he always sent a detailed statement of the month's profit and loss on the chickens, at least the month's loss on the chickens, and this detailed statement included the various items of expense: corn for the chickens, a bonnet for the wife, boots for himself, and so on, even carfares, and the weekly contribution of 10 cents to help out the missionaries who were trying to damn the Chinese after a plan not satisfactory to those people. But at last, when among those details I found $25 for pew rent, I struck. I told him to change his religion and sell the pew. End of Section 41, Thursday, April 5, 1906. Section 42 of Mark Twain's Autobiography, Volume 2. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. Friday, April 6, 1906. Mr. Clemens's present house unsatisfactory because of no sunshine. Mr. Clemens meets Etta in Washington Square. Recalls ballroom in Virginia City 44 years ago. Orion resumed. He invents wood sawing machine. Invents steam canal boat. Orion's autobiography. His death. This house is number 21 Fifth Avenue, and stands on the corner of Ninth Street, within a couple of hundred yards of Washington Square. It was built 50 or 60 years ago by Renwick, the architect of the Roman Catholic Cathedral. It is large, and every story has good and spacious rooms, but not enough sunshine. Yesterday I went down to Washington Square, turned out to the left to look at a house that stands on the corner of the square and University Place. Presently I stepped over to the corner of the square to take a general look at the frontage of the house. While crossing the street I met a woman and was conscious that she recognized me, and it seemed to me that there was something in her face that was familiar to me. I had the instinct that she would turn and follow me and speak to me, and the instinct was right. She was a fat little woman, with a gentle and kindly but aged and homely face, and she had white hair, and was neatly but poorly dressed. She said, "Aren't you Mr. Clemens?" "Yes," I said, "I am." She said, "Where is your brother Orion?" "Dead," I said. "Where is his wife?" "Dead," I said, and added, "I seem to know you, but I cannot place you." She said, "Do you remember Etta Booth?" I had known only one Etta Booth in my lifetime, and that Etta rose before me in an instant, and vividly. It was almost as if she stood alongside of this fat little antiquated dame, in the bloom and diffidence and sweetness of her 13 years, her hair in plaited tails down her back, and her fiery red frock stopping short at her knees. Indeed, I remembered Etta very well, and immediately another vision rose before me, with that child in the center of it, and accenting its sober tint like a torch with her red frock. But it was not a quiet vision, not a reposeful one. The scene was a great ballroom in some ramshackle building in Gold Hill or Virginia City, Nevada. There were 200 or 300 stalwart men present and dancing with cordial energy, and in the midst of the turmoil Etta's crimson frock was swirling and flashing, and she was the only dancer of her sex on the floor. Her mother, large, fleshy, pleasant, and smiling, sat on a bench against the wall in lonely and honored state, and watched the festivities in placid contentment. She and Etta were the only persons of their sex in the ballroom. Half of the men represented ladies, and they had a handkerchief tied around the left arm so that they could be told from the men. I did not dance with Etta, for I was a lady myself. I wore a revolver in my belt, and so did all the other ladies, likewise the gentlemen. It was a dismal old barn of a place, and was lighted from end to end by tallow candle chandeliers made of barrel hoops suspended from the ceiling, and the grease dripped all over us. That was in the beginning of the winter of 1862. It has taken 44 years for Etta to cross my orbit again. I asked after her father. "Dead," she said. I asked after her mother. "Dead," she said. Another question brought out the fact that she had long been married, but had no children. We shook hands and parted. She walked 3 or 4 steps, then turned and came back, and her eyes filled, and she said, "I am a stranger here, and far from my friends. In fact, I have hardly any friends left. Nearly all of them are dead. I must tell my news to you. I must tell it to somebody. I can't bear it myself while it is so new. The doctor has just told me that my husband can live only a very little while, and I was not dreaming it was so bad as this. Orion resumed. I think the poultry experiment lasted only a year, possibly 2 years. It had then cost me $6,000. It is my impression that Orion was not able to give the farm away, and that his father in law took it back as a kindly act of self sacrifice. Orion returned to the law business, and I suppose he remained in that harness off and on for the succeeding quarter of a century, but so far as my knowledge goes he was only a lawyer in name, and had no clients. My mother died in her 88th year, in the summer of 1890. She had saved some money, and she left it to me, because it had come from me. I gave it to Orion, and he said, with thanks, that I had supported him long enough, and now he was going to relieve me of that burden, and would also hope to pay back some of that expense, and maybe the whole of it. Accordingly he proceeded to use up that money in building a considerable addition to the house, with the idea of taking boarders and getting rich. We need not dwell upon this venture. It was another of his failures. His wife tried hard to make the scheme succeed, and if anybody could have made it succeed she would have done it. She was a good woman, and was greatly liked. Her vanity was pretty large and inconvenient, but she had a practical side, too, and she would have made that boarding house lucrative if circumstances had not been against her. Orion had other projects for recouping me, but as they always required capital I stayed out of them, but they did not materialize. Once he wanted to start a newspaper. It was a ghastly idea, and I squelched it with a promptness that was almost rude. Then he invented a wood sawing machine, and patched it together himself, and he really sawed wood with it. It was ingenious, it was capable, and it would have made a comfortable little fortune for him, but just at the wrong time Providence interfered again. Orion applied for a patent, and found that the same machine had already been patented, and had gone into business and was thriving. Presently the State of New York offered a $50,000 prize for a practical method of navigating the Erie Canal with steam canal boats. Orion worked at that thing 2 or 3 years, invented and completed a method, and was once more ready to reach out and seize upon imminent wealth, when somebody pointed out a defect. His steam canal boat could not be used in the winter time, and in the summer time the commotion its wheels would make in the water would wash away the State of New York on both sides. Innumerable were Orion's projects for acquiring the means to pay off his debt to me. These projects extended straight through the succeeding 30 years, but in every case they failed. During all those 30 years Orion's well-established honesty kept him in offices of trust where other people's money had to be taken care of, but where no salary was paid. He was treasurer of all the benevolent institutions. He took care of the money and other property of widows and orphans. He never lost a cent for anybody. and never made one for himself. Every time he changed his religion, the church of his new faith was glad to get him, made him treasurer at once, and at once he stopped the graft and the leaks in that church. He exhibited a facility in changing his political complexion that was a marvel to the whole community. Once this curious thing happened, and he wrote me all about it himself. One morning he was a Republican, and upon invitation he agreed to make a campaign speech at the Republican mass meeting that night. He prepared the speech. After luncheon he became a Democrat, and agreed to write a score of exciting mottos to be painted upon the transparencies which the Democrats would carry in their torchlight procession that night. He wrote these shouting Democratic mottos during the afternoon, and they occupied so much of his time that it was night before he had a chance to change his politics again, so he actually made a rousing Republican campaign speech in the open air while his Democratic transparencies passed by in front of him, to the joy of every witness present. He was a strange creature, but in spite of his eccentricities he was beloved all his life, in whatsoever community he lived, and he was also held in high esteem, for at bottom he was a sterling man. About 25 years ago, along there somewhere, I wrote and suggested to Orion that he write an autobiography. I asked him to try to tell the straight truth in it, to refrain from exhibiting himself in creditable attitudes exclusively, and to honorably set down all the incidents of his life which he had found interesting to him, including those which were burned into his memory because he was ashamed of them. I said that this had never been done, and that if he could do it his autobiography would be a most valuable piece of literature. I said I was offering him a job which I could not duplicate in my own case, but I would cherish the hope that he might succeed with it. I recognize now that I was trying to saddle upon him an impossibility. I have been dictating this autobiography of mine daily for 3 months. I have thought of 1,500 or 2,000 incidents in my life which I am ashamed of, but I have not gotten one of them to consent to go on paper yet. I think that that stock will still be complete and unimpaired when I finish this autobiography, if I ever finish it. I believe that if I should put in all those incidents I would be sure to strike them out when I came to revise this book. While we were living in Vienna in 1898 a cablegram came from Keokuk announcing Orion's death. He was 72 years old. He had gone down to the kitchen in the early hours of a bitter December morning. He had built the fire, and then sat down at a table to write something, and there he died, with the pencil in his hand and resting against the paper in the middle of an unfinished word, an indication that his release from the captivity of a long and troubled and pathetic and unprofitable life was swift and painless. End of section 42. Friday, April 6, 1906. Section 43 of Mark Twain's Autobiography, Volume 2. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. Monday, April 9, 1906. Letter from French girl enclosing cable about Huck Finn. The Juggernaut Club. Letter from librarian of Brooklyn Public Library in regard to Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer. Mr. Clemens's reply. The deluge of reporters trying to discuss contents of that letter. This morning's mail brings me from France a letter from a French friend of mine, enclosing this New York cablegram: Mark Twain interdit. New York, 27 mars. Par dépêche de notre correspondant particulier. Les directeurs de la bibliothèque de Brooklyn ont mis les 2 derniers livres de Mark Twain à l'index pour les enfants au-dessus de 15 ans, les considérant comme malsains. Le célèbre humoriste a écrit à des fonctionnaires une lettre pleine d'esprit et de sarcasme. Ces messieurs se refusent à la publier, sous le prétexte qu'ils n'ont pas l'autorisation de l'auteur de l'affaire. The letter is from a French girl who lives at Saint-Denis, in Joan of Arc's region. I have never seen this French girl, but she wrote me about 5 years ago, and since then we have exchanged friendly letters 3 or 4 times a year. She closes her letter with this paragraph: Something in a newspaper that I read this morning has surprised me very much. I have cut it out because often these informations are forged, and if this is the case the slip of paper will be my excuse. Please allow me to smile, my dear unseen friend. I cannot imagine for a minute that you have been very sorry about it. In France such a measure would have for immediate result to make every one in the country buy these books, and I for one am going to get them as soon as I go through Paris, perfectly sure that I'll find them as wholesome as all you have written. I know your pen well. I know it has never dipped in anything but clean, clear ink. I must go back now to that French cablegram. Its information is not exactly correct, but it is near enough. Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer are not recent books. Tom is more than 30 years old. The other book has been in existence 21 years. When Huck appeared, 21 years ago, the Public Library of Concord, Massachusetts, flung him out indignantly, partly because he was a liar, and partly because, after deep meditation and careful deliberation, he made up his mind on a difficult point, and said that if he'd got to betray Jim or go to hell, he would go to hell, which was profanity, and those Concord purists couldn't stand it. After this disaster Huck was left in peace for 16 or 17 years. Then the Public Library of Denver flung him out. He had no similar trouble until 4 or 5 months ago, that is to say, last November. At that time I received the following letter: Sheepshead Bay Branch, Brooklyn Public Library, 1657 Shore Road, Brooklyn, New York, November 19, '05. Dear Sir, I happened to be present the other day at a meeting of the children's librarians of the Brooklyn Public Library. In the course of the meeting it was stated that copies of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn were to be found in some of the children's rooms of the system. The superintendent of the children's department, a conscientious and enthusiastic young woman, was greatly shocked to hear this, and at once ordered that they be transferred to the adults' department. Upon this I shamefacedly confessed to having read Huckleberry Finn aloud to my defenseless blind people, without regard to their age, color, or previous condition of servitude. I also reminded them of Brander Matthews' opinion of the book, and stated the fact that I knew it almost at heart, having got more pleasure from it than from any book I have ever read, and reading is the greatest pleasure I have in life. My warm defense elicited some further discussion and criticism, from which I gathered that the prevailing opinion of Huck was that he was a deceitful boy who said sweat when he should have said perspiration. The upshot of the matter was that there is to be further consideration of these books at a meeting early in January, which I am especially invited to attend. Seeing you the other night at the performance of Peter Pan, the thought came to me that you, who know Huck as well as you can't know him better or love him more, might be willing to give me a word or two to say in witness of his good character, though he warn't no more quality than a mudcat. I would ask as a favor that you regard this communication as confidential, whether you find time to reply to it or not, for I am loath, for obvious reasons, to bring the institution from which I draw my salary into ridicule, contempt, or reproach. Yours very respectfully, Asa Don Dickinson, in charge, Department for the Blind and Sheepshead Bay Branch, Brooklyn Public Library. That was a very private letter. I didn't know the author of it, but I thought I perceived that he was a safe man, and that I could venture to write a pretty private letter in return, and trust that he would not allow its dreadful contents to leak out and get into the newspapers. I wrote him on the 21st. 21 Fifth Avenue, November 21, 1905. Dear Sir, I am greatly troubled by what you say. I wrote Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn for adults exclusively, and it always distresses me when I find that boys and girls have been allowed access to them. The mind that becomes soiled in youth can never again be washed clean. I know this by my own experience, and to this day I cherish an unappeasable bitterness against the unfaithful guardians of my young life, who not only permitted but compelled me to read an unexpurgated Bible through before I was 15 years old. None can do that and ever draw a clean, sweet breath again this side of the grave. Ask that young lady; she will tell you so. Most honestly do wish I could say a softening word or two in defense of Huck's character, since you wish it, but really in my opinion it is no better than those of Solomon, David, Satan, and the rest of the sacred brotherhood. If there is an unexpurgated in the children's department, won't you please help that young woman remove Huck and Tom from that questionable companionship? Sincerely yours, (Signed) S. L. Clemens. I shall not show your letter to any one. It is safe with me. A couple of days later I received this handsome rejoinder in return: Sheepshead Bay Branch, Brooklyn Public Library, 1657 Shore Road, Brooklyn, New York, November 23, '05. Dear Sir, your letter received. I am surprised to hear that you think Huck and Tom would have an unwelcome effect on boys and girls, but relieved to hear that you would not place them in the same category with many of the scriptural reprobates. I know of one boy who made the acquaintance of Huck in 1884 at the age of 8, and who has known him intimately ever since, and I can assure you he is not an atom the worse for the 20 years' companionship. On the contrary, he will always feel grateful to Huck's father I don't mean Pop for the many hours spent with him and Jim when sickness and sorrow were forgotten. Huckleberry Finn was the first book I selected to read to my blind, for selfish reasons, I am afraid, and the amount of innocent enjoyment it gave them has never been equaled by anything I have since read. Thanking you for the almost unhoped for courtesy of your reply, I am, yours very respectfully, Asa Don Dickinson. 4 months drifted tranquilly by. Then there was music. There came a freshet of newspaper reporters, and they besieged my secretary all day. Of course I was in bed. I am always in bed. She barred the stairs against them. They were bound to see me, if only for a moment, but none of them got by her guard. They said a report had sprung up that I had written a letter some months before to the Brooklyn Public Library, that, according to that report, the letter was pungent and valuable, and they wanted a copy of it. They said the head officials of the Brooklyn Library declared that they had never seen the letter, and that they had never heard of it until the reporters came and asked for it. I judged by this that my man, who was not in the head library, but in a branch of it, was keeping his secret all right, and I believed he could be trusted to continue to keep that secret, for his own sake as well as mine. That letter would be a bombshell for me if it got out, but it would hoist him, too. So I feel pretty confident that, for his own sake, if for no other, he would protect me. My secretary had a hard day of it, but I had a most enjoyable one. She never allowed any reporter to get an idea of the nature of the letter. She smoothed all those young fellows down and sent them away empty. They renewed the assault next day, but I told her to never mind, human nature would win the victory for us. There would be an earthquake somewhere, or a municipal upheaval here, or a threat of war in Europe. Something would be sure to happen in the way of a big excitement that would call the boys away from number 21 Fifth Avenue for 24 hours, and that would answer every purpose. They wouldn't think of that letter again, and we should have peace. I knew the reporters would get on the right track very soon, so I wrote Mr. Dickinson and warned him to keep his mouth hermetically sealed. I told him to be wise and wary. His answer bears date March 28th. Bay Ridge Branch, Brooklyn Public Library, 73rd Street and 2nd Avenue, Brooklyn, New York, March 28, '06. Dear Mr. Clemens, your letter of the 26th inst. Received this moment. As I have now been transferred to the above address, it has been a long time reaching me. I have tried to be wary and wise, and am very grateful to you for your reticence. The poor old B.P.L. has achieved some very undesirable notoriety. I thought my head was coming off when I heard from my chief on the telephone night before last, but yesterday he began to be amused, I think, at the Teapot Tempest. Last night I reached home at 11:30 and found a Herald man sitting on the steps, leaning his head against the door post. He had been there since 7:30, and said he would cheerfully sit there till morning if I would give him the least hint of the letter's contents. But I was wise and wary. At the January meeting it was decided not to place Huck and Tom in the children's room along with Little Nellie's silver mine and Dottie Dimple at home, but the books have not been restricted in any sense whatever. They are placed on open shelves among the adult fiction, and any child is free to read adult fiction if he chooses. I am looking forward with great eagerness to seeing and hearing you tomorrow night at the Waldorf, as I have a wild scheme for a national library for the blind. They have been generous enough to place a couple of boxes at my disposal. The young lady whom you mentioned in your letter, the superintendent of the children's department, and several other B.P.L.'s, I hope will be present. I am very sorry to have caused you so much annoyance through reporters, but be sure that I have said nothing, nor will say anything to them about the contents of that letter, and please don't you tell on me. Yours very respectfully, Asa Don Dickinson. I saw him at the Waldorf the next night, where Choate and I made our public appeal in behalf of the blind, and found him to be a very pleasant and safe and satisfactory man. Now that I have heard from France, I think the incident is closed, for it had its brief run in England 2 or 3 weeks ago, and in Germany also. When people let Huck Finn alone he goes peacefully along, damaging a few children here and there and yonder, but there will be plenty of children in heaven without those, so it is no great matter. It is only when well-meaning people expose him that he gets his real chance to do harm. Temporarily, then, he spreads havoc all around in the nurseries, and no doubt does prodigious harm while he has his chance. By and by, let us hope, people that really have the best interests of the rising generation at heart will become wise and not stir Huck up. End of section 43, Monday, April 9, 1906. Section 44 of Mark Twain's Autobiography, Volume 2. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. Tuesday, April 10, 1906. Child's letter about Huckleberry Finn being flung out of Concord Library. Ambassador White's autobiography. Mr. Clemens's version of the Fisk Cornell episode. Another example of his great scheme for finding employment for the unemployed. This client wins the Fisk lawsuit. When Huck Finn was flung out of the Concord Public Library 21 years ago, a number of letters of sympathy and indignation reached me, mainly from children, I am obliged to admit, and I kept some of them so that I might reread them now and then and apply them as a salve to my soreness. I have overhauled those ancient letters this morning, and among them I find one from a little girl who resents that library's treatment of Huck, and then goes innocently along and gives me something more of a dig than even the library had done. She says, I am 11 years old, and I live on a farm near Rockville, Maryland. Once this winter we had a boy to work for us named John. We lent him Huck Finn to read, and one night he let his clothes out of the window and left in the night. The last we heard from him he was out in Ohio, and father says if we had lent him Tom Sawyer to read he would not have stopped on this side of the ocean. Bless her gentle heart, she was trying to cheer me up, and her effort is entitled to the praise which the country journalist conferred upon the Essex band after he had praised the whole Fourth of July celebration in detail and had exhausted his stock of compliments. But he was obliged to lay something in the nature of a complimentary egg, and with a final heroic effort he brought forth this: "The Essex band done the best they could." I have been reading another chapter or two in Ambassador White's Autobiography, and I find the book charming, particularly where he talks about me. I find any book charming that talks about me. I am expecting this one of mine to do something in that line, and it is my purpose that it shall not lose sight of that subject long at a time. Mr. White was the first president of Cornell University, and he gives the university side of the Willard Fiske trouble. I stopped at that point. I didn't read his version, for I want to give another version first, and as this version may conflict with his, I wish to set it down now, before its complexion shall have a chance to undergo a change by coming in contact with his version. This brings me back to another example of my great scheme for finding work for the unemployed. The famous Fiske Cornell episode of a quarter of a century ago grew up in this way. About 50 years ago, when Willard Fiske was a poor and untaught and friendless boy of 13, he and Bayard Taylor took steerage passage in a sailing ship and crossed the ocean. They found their way to Iceland, and Willard Fiske remained there a year or two. He acquired the Norse languages and perfected himself in them. He also became an expert scholar in the literature of those languages. By and by he returned to America, and while still a very young man and hardly of age, he got a place as instructor in that kind of learning in the infant Cornell University. This seat of learning was at Ithaca, New York, and Mr. McGraw was a citizen of that little town. He had made a fortune in the electric telegraph, and it was his purpose to leave a large part of it to the university. He had a lovely young daughter, and she and young Fiske fell in love with each other. They were aware of this, the girl's parents were aware of it, the university was aware of it, Ithaca was aware of it. All these parties expected Fiske to propose, but he didn't do it. There was no way to account for it, and so all the parties, including the girl, went on from month to month and year to year in a condition of suppressed surprise, waiting for the mystery to solve itself, which it still didn't do. At last Mr. McGraw died, and the fact developed that he had left no will. Therefore the daughter was sole heir. However, she knew what her father's intention had been, so she turned over to the university a good part of the fortune and thus made the intention good. The years drifted along, and the relations between Fiske and Miss McGraw remained the same, but there was no proposal. Fiske had a quite definite reason for not proposing. It was that he was very poor and the girl very rich, and he was not willing to seem to marry her for her money. This was good morals, good principle, good sentiment, but it was not business. Things remained just in this way for years and years, and the devotion of the couple to each other went along unimpaired by time. At last, when they were well stricken in years, and when Miss McGraw had developed pulmonary consumption, she invited Fiske and Charles Dudley Warner and his wife to make a trip up the Nile with her in the old fashioned dahabeah, a trip which occupied a matter of 3 months. Miss McGraw had already been on the other side of the ocean several months, and she had been buying all sorts of beautiful things, pictures, sculpture, costly rugs, and so on, wherewith to adorn a little palace which she was building in Ithaca. At last, there on board the dahabeah, a sorrowful time came, for Miss McGraw's malady was making great progress, and it was manifest that she could not live long. Then she came out frankly and said she wanted to marry Fiske so that she could leave her fortune to him. Fiske wanted to marry her, but his ideas remained unimpaired in his heart and head, and he was not willing to accept the fortune. The Warrens wrought with him. They used their best persuasions. He was as anxious for the marriage as was Miss McGraw, but he wouldn't accept the fortune. At last he was persuaded to a modification of the terms. He was willing to accept the little palace and its furnishings and $300,000. He would accept nothing more. The marriage took place. Mrs. Fiske made a will, and in the will she left the palace and its furnishings and $300,000 to her husband, Willard Fiske. She left the residue of the fortune to Cornell University. By and by Fiske arrived at an understanding of the fact that he had not acted wisely. The income of $300,000 was wholly inadequate. He could not live in the Ithaca house on any such income as that. He did not try to live in it. There it stood, with all those beautiful things in it which Miss McGraw had gathered in her travels in Europe, and Fiske lived elsewhere, lived most comfortably elsewhere, lived where $300,000 was really a fortune, and he was entirely satisfied. He lived in Italy. He was as dear and sweet a soul as I have ever known. His was a character which won friends for him, and whoso became his friend remained so ever afterward. Now followed this curious circumstance. Cornell had received by Mrs. Fiske's will a noble addition to its endowment, $2,000,000, if I remember rightly. No doubt Cornell University was satisfied, but the university's lawyers, picking and searching around through Mrs. Fiske's will, found a defect in it which neither Mrs. Fiske nor Charlie Warner, who drew the will, suspected was there. It was something about residue. It was the opinion of those lawyers that the university might claim the little palace and its rich equipment, and make the claim good in a court of law. The claim was put forward. Fiske and Warner were outraged by this insolence, this greed. Both knew that it was the desire of the dying wife that her husband should live in that house and have the sacred companionship of those things which had been selected by her own hands for its adornment. Both knew that but for Fiske's stubborn resistance he would have had not only the house, but a great sum of money besides. And now that the university proposed to take the house away from Fiske, well, it was time for the worm to turn. The worm turned. Fiske was the worm. Fiske resisted the university's claim, and the university brought suit. Now then, I must go back to a point antedating the bringing of this suit 3 or 4 years. One day in Hartford a young fellow called and wanted to see me. I think he said he was from Canada. He said he had a strong desire, an irresistible desire, to become a lawyer, and he thought that if he could get some work to do that would support him, he could meantime use his off hours, if he had any, in studying Blackstone. He thought he could be a journalist. He thought he could at least become a good reporter, and his idea was to get me to use my influence with the Hartford newspaper people to the end that he might get the sort of chance he was after. I said, "Certainly, I will get you a berth in any newspaper in the town. Choose your own paper." He was very grateful. These clients of mine always are, until they learn the conditions. I furnished him the conditions in the same old way. He considered a moment and then said, "How simple that is! How sure it is! How certain it is! How actually infallible it is, human nature being constructed as it is! How is it that that has not been thought of before?" Then he added, as he went out of the door, "I choose the Courant, and I will have the job before night." About 3 months afterward he came out to report progress. He had moved along so briskly from sweeper out up through the several grades that he was now on the editorial staff, and was very happy, particularly as staff work allowed him a good deal of off time for the study of law, and the law was where his high ambition lay. I come back now to that Fisk lawsuit. We had gone to Elmira one summer to spend the summer, as usual, at Quarry Farm, and we were visiting Mrs. Clemens's family down in the town for a while. A young man called and said he would like to see me. I went to the library and saw him there. It was the young man of whom I have been talking, but as I had not seen him for 3 or 4 years I did not at first recall him. He said that while he was on the Courant he saved all the money he could and studied the law diligently in his off hours, that now, recently, he had given up journalism and was going to make a break into the law, that he had canvassed the field and had decided that he would become office assistant to David B. Hill of Elmira, New York. That is to say, he had decided to do this, evidently, without requiring Mr. Hill to state whether he wanted it so or not. Hill was a very distinguished lawyer, and a big politician, a man of vast importance and influence, and he is still that today in his old age. The application was made, and Hill said promptly that he didn't need anybody's assistance. But young Bacon said he didn't want any pay. He only wanted a chance to work. He could support himself. He would do anything that could be of any assistance to Mr. Hill, even to sweeping out the office, that he wanted to work, and he wanted to be near a man like Hill because he was determined to become a lawyer. Well, as he was not expensive and showed a determination that pleased Hill, Hill gave him office room. Very well, the usual thing happened, the thing that always happens. Little by little Bacon got to beguiling out of Hill things to do, and presently Hill was furnishing him the things to do without any beguilement. "Now then," Bacon said, Mr. Clemens, I've got a chance. I've got a chance." Professor Willard Fiske brought his case to Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill examined it carefully and declined to take it. He said Fiske had no case, and therefore he did not to wish to take it merely to lose it. Fiske insisted, and presently Hill said, "Well, here's this young fellow here in my office. If he wants to take your case, all right. I will advise him and help him to the best of my ability, without charge." And he asked if Fiske was willing to put the case into Bacon's hands. Fiske did it. Then young Bacon had this happy idea. There being nothing for Fiske in the apparent conditions, he went to the university charter to see what he might find there. He found a very pleasant thing there. To use a phrase of the day, he struck oil in that charter. He brought the charter to Mr. Hill and showed him this large fact: that Cornell University was not privileged to accept or to acquire any property if, at the time, it already possessed property worth $3 millions. Cornell University possessed property worth more than that at the time that Mrs. Fiske made her will, and it still possessed that amount. Hill said, "Well, Bacon, the case is yours. That is to say, well, Bacon, the case is Fiske's. It is the university now that has no show." Bacon won the case. It was his first case. He charged Fiske $100,000 for his services. Fiske handed him the check, and his thanks therewith. I didn't see Bacon again for some years, I don't know how many, and then he told me that that first lawsuit of his was also his last one, that that first fee of his was the only one he had ever received, that he had hardly pocketed his check until he ran across a most charming young widow, possessed of a great fortune, and he took them both in. I think I will say nothing more about my great scheme for providing jobs for the unemployed. I think I have proven that it is a good and effective scheme. End of Section 44, Tuesday, April 10, 1906. Section 45 of Mark Twain's Autobiography, Volume 2. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. Wednesday, April 11, 1906. Mr. Frank Fuller and his enthusiastic launching of Mr. Clemens's first New York lecture. Results not in fortune but in fame. Leads to a lecture tour under direction of Redpath. Clipping in regard to Frank Fuller and Mr. Clemens's comments. I am not glancing through my books to find out what I have said in them. I refrain from glancing through those books for two reasons. First, and this reason always comes first in every matter connected with my life, laziness. I am too lazy to examine the books. The other reason is, well, let it go. I had another reason, but it had slipped out of my mind while I was arranging the first one. I think it likely that in the book called Roughing It I have mentioned Frank Fuller, but I don't know, and it isn't any matter. When Orion and I crossed the continent in the overland stagecoach in the summer of 1861, we stopped 2 or 3 days in Great Salt Lake City. I do not remember who the governor of Utah Territory was at that time, but I remember that he was absent, which is a common habit of Territorial governors, who are nothing but politicians who go out to the outskirts of countries and suffer the privations there in order to build up states and come back as United States senators. But the man who was acting in the governor's place was the secretary of the Territory, Frank Fuller, called governor, of course, just as Orion was in the great days when he got that accident title through Governor Nye's absences. Titles of honor and dignity once acquired in a democracy, even by accident and properly usable for only 48 hours, are as permanent here as eternity is in heaven. You can never take away those titles. Once a justice of the peace for a week, always judge afterward. Once a major of militia for a campaign on the 4th of July, always a major. To be called colonel purely by mistake and without intention confers that dignity on a man for the rest of his life. We adore titles and heredities in our hearts and ridicule them with our mouths. This is our democratic privilege. Well, Fuller was acting governor, and he gave us a very good time during those 2 or 3 days that we rested in Great Salt Lake City. He was an alert and energetic man, a pushing man, a man who was able to take an interest in anything that was going, and not only that, but take 5 times as much interest in it as it was worth, and 10 times as much as anybody else could take in it. A very live man. I was on the Pacific coast thereafter 5 or 6 years, and returned to the States by way of the Isthmus in January, '67. In the previous year I had spent several months in the Sandwich Islands for the Sacramento Union, and had returned to San Francisco empty as to cash, but full of information proper for delivery from the lecture platform. My letters from the islands had given me a large notoriety, local notoriety. It did not extend eastward more than 100 miles or so, but it was a good notoriety to lecture on, and I made use of it on the platform in California and Nevada, and amassed $1,200 or $1,500 in the few nights that I labored for the instruction and amusement of my public. $1,500 was about half. The doorkeeper got the rest. He was an old circus man and knew how to keep door. When I arrived in New York I found Fuller there in some kind of business. He was very hearty, very glad to see me, and wanted to show me his wife. I had not heard of a wife before, had not been aware that he had one. Well, he showed me his wife, a sweet and gentle woman with most hospitable and kindly and winning ways. Then he astonished me by showing me his daughters. Upon my word, they were large and matronly of aspect and married. He didn't say how long. Oh, Fuller was full of surprises. If he had shown me some little children, that would have been well enough and reasonable, but he was too young looking a man to have grown children. Well, I couldn't fathom the mystery, and I let it go. Apparently it was a case where a man was well along in life, but had a handsome gift of not showing his age on the outside. Governor Fuller it is what all his New York friends called him now, of course was in the full storm of one of his enthusiasms. He had one enthusiasm per day, and it was always a storm. He said I must take the biggest hall in New York and deliver that lecture of mine on the Sandwich Islands, said that people would be wild to hear me. There was something catching about that man's prodigious energy. For a moment he almost convinced me that New York was wild to hear me. I knew better. I was well aware that New York had never heard of me, was not expecting to hear of me, and didn't want to hear of me. Yet that man almost persuaded me. I protested, as soon as the fire which he had kindled in me had cooled a little, and went on protesting. It did no good. Fuller was sure that I should make fame and fortune right away, without any trouble. He said, leave it to him, just leave everything to him. Go to the hotel and sit down and be comfortable. He would lay fame and fortune at my feet in 10 days. I was helpless. I was persuadable, but I didn't lose all of my mind, and I begged him to take a very small hall and reduce the rates to side-show prices. No, he would not hear of that. Said he would have the biggest hall in New York City. He would have the basement hall in Cooper Institute, which seated 3,000 people, and there was room for half as many more to stand up. And he said he would fill that place so full, at $1 a head, that those people would smother, and he could charge $2 apiece to let them out. Oh, he was all fire with his project. He went ahead with it. He said it shouldn't cost me anything. I said there would be no profit. He said, leave that alone. If there is no profit, that is my affair. If there is profit, it is yours. If it is loss, I stand the loss myself, and you will never hear of it. He hired Cooper Institute, and he began to advertise this lecture in the usual way, a small paragraph in the advertising columns of the newspapers. When this had continued about 3 days, I had not yet heard anybody or any newspaper say anything about that lecture, and I got nervous. "Oh," he said, "it's working around underneath. You don't see it on the surface." He said, "Let it alone now. Let it work." Very well, I allowed it to work until about the 6th or 7th day. The lecture would be due in 3 or 4 days more. Still I was not able to get down underneath where it was working, and so I was filled with doubt and distress. I went to Fuller and said he must advertise more energetically. He said he would. So he got a barrel of little things printed that you hang on a string, 50 in a bunch. They were for the omnibuses. You could see them swinging and dangling around in every omnibus. My anxiety forced me to haunt those omnibuses. I did nothing for 1 or 2 days but sit in buses, and travel from one end of New York to the other, and watch those things dangle, and wait to catch somebody pulling one loose to read it. It never happened. At least it happened only once. A man reached up and pulled one of those things loose, said to his friend, "Lecture on Sandwich Islands by Mark Twain. Who can that be, I wonder?" And he threw it away and changed the subject. I couldn't travel in the omnibus any more. I was sick. I went to Fuller and said, "Fuller, there is not going to be anybody in Cooper Institute that night but you and me. It will be a dead loss, for we shall both have free tickets. Something must be done. I am on the verge of suicide. I would commit suicide if I had the pluck and the outfit." I said, "You must paper the house, Fuller. You must issue thousands of complimentary tickets. You must do this. I shall die if I have to go before an empty house that is not acquainted with me, and that has never heard of me, and that has never traveled in the bus and seen those things dangle." "Well," he said, with his customary enthusiasm, "I'll attend to it. It shall be done. I will paper that house, and when you step on the platform you shall find yourself in the presence of the choicest audience, the most intelligent audience that ever a man stood before in this world." And he was as good as his word. He sent whole baskets full of complimentary tickets to every public school teacher within a radius of 30 miles of New York. He deluged those people with complimentary tickets, and on the appointed night they all came. There wasn't room in Cooper Institute for a third of them. The lecture was to begin at 7:30. I was so anxious that I had to go to that place at 7. I couldn't keep away. I wanted to see that vast, vacant Mammoth Cave and die. But when I got near the building I found that all the streets for a quarter of a mile around were blocked with people, and traffic was stopped. I couldn't believe that those people were trying to get into Cooper Institute, and yet that was just what was happening. I found my way around to the back of the building and got in there by the stage door, and sure enough the seats, the aisles, the great stage itself was packed with bright looking human beings raked in from the centers of intelligence, the schools. I had a deal of difficulty to shoulder my way through the mass of people on the stage, and when I had managed it and stood before the audience, that stage was full. There wasn't room enough left for a child. I was happy, and I was excited beyond expression. I poured the Sandwich Islands out on to those people with a free hand, and they laughed and they shouted to my entire content. For an hour and 15 minutes I was in paradise. From every pore I exuded a divine delight, and when we came to count up we had $35 in the house. Fuller was just as jubilant over it as if it had furnished the fame and the fortune of his prophecy. He was perfectly delighted, perfectly enchanted. He couldn't keep his mouth shut for several days. "Oh," he said, "the fortune didn't come in. That didn't come in. That's all right. That's coming in later. The fame is already here, Mark. Why, in a week you'll be the best known man in the United States. This is no failure. This is a prodigious success." That episode must have cost him $400 or $500, but he never said a word about that. He was as happy, as satisfied, as proud, as delighted as if he had laid the fabled golden egg and hatched it. He was right about the fame. I certainly did get a working quantity of fame out of that lecture. The New York newspapers praised it. The country newspapers copied those praises. The lyceums of the country it was right in the heyday of the old lyceum lecture system began to call for me. I put myself in Redpath's hands, and I caught the tail end of the lecture season. I went West and lectured every night for 6 or 8 weeks at $100 a night, and I now considered that the whole of the prophecy was fulfilled. I had acquired fame and also fortune. I don't believe these details are right, but I don't care a rap. They will do just as well as the facts. What I mean to say is that I don't know whether I made that lecturing excursion in that year or whether it was the following year, but the main thing is that I made it, and that the opportunity to make it was created by that wild Frank Fuller and his insane and immortal project. All this was 38 or 39 years ago. 2 or 3 times since then, at intervals of years, I have run across Frank Fuller for a moment, only a moment and no more, but he was always young, never a gray hair, never a suggestion of age about him, always enthusiastic, always happy and glad to be alive. Last fall his wife's brother was murdered in a horrible way. Apparently a robber had concealed himself in Mr. Thompson's room, and in the night had beaten him to death with a club. A couple of months ago I ran across Fuller on the street, and he was looking so very, very old, so withered, so moldy, that I could hardly recognize him. He said his wife was dying of the shock caused by the murder of her brother, that nervous prostration was carrying her off, and she could not live more than a few days. So I went with him to see her. She was sitting upright on a sofa, and was supported all about with pillows. Now and then she leaned her head for a little while on a support. Breathing was difficult for her. It touched me, for I had seen that picture so many, many times. During 2 or 3 months Mrs. Clemens sat up like that, day and night, struggling for breath. When she was made drowsy by opiates and exhaustion, she rested her head a little while on a support, just as Mrs. Fuller was doing, and got naps of 2 minutes or 3 minutes duration. I did not see Mrs. Fuller alive again. She passed to her rest about 3 days later. End of section 45 and end of Mark Twain's Autobiography, Volume 2. Read by John Greenman.